Hello, and welcome to Sammy C. Press. Today, I'd like to tell you a story, a mouse's tale as it were, of three little mice. Mrs. Mouse, who we'll call Mrs. M for short, and her two children, Lucas and Toby, as well as her friend Jimmy that likes to stop by after school. Let's look in. Toby and Lucas are happily chatting away at the table while Mrs. M is preparing their after-school snack, the cheese variety, of course. Mrs. M was smiling to herself because school days did not always end on a happy note. You see, all three of them had what's known as dysmousia. In humans' terms, it would be dyslexia. They really struggled to learn to read, and Mrs. Mouse was determined to help Lucas and Toby to be able to learn so without so much frustration. So she had some tricks up her sleeves. One of Toby and Lucas's favorites was when she gathered clay and they would shape the clay into letters of the alphabet. And then she would help Lucas and Toby to connect the sound the letter made with the letter. And this really helped Lucas and Toby with their reading, as well as their friend Jimmy, who has started to stop by to do a little tutoring with the three of them. He's already learned to spell as well as read cat and rat, which is super exciting. While Mrs. M was smiling to herself, the door burst open and Jimmy came in frantic. "Oh, Mrs. M, you would not believe the day I had today," Jimmy said very distraughtly. "What happened, Jimmy?" Mrs. M said as she quickly moved over to Jimmy. "Mrs. Mean was she was just so mean. She made me stand in front of the class and read these two sentences, and she knows I struggle to read. Oh, it's so unfair, Mrs. M." Mrs. M was upset to hear the day that Jimmy had, and she gave him a hug and said, There, Jimmy, it's gonna be okay." "Oh, Mrs. M, that wasn't even the worst of it. The students all pointed and laughed at me and called me a baby, and they said at my age I should be able to read by now. Oh, it was so awful. I don't want to go back, Mrs. M." Jimmy was so very upset. Mrs. M hugged him tighter. "It's okay, Jimmy. It's okay." "Why can't I just be homeschooled like Lucas and Toby?" Jimmy whined. "Now, Jimmy, we've talked about this. Not every family can homeschool," Mrs. M said calmly. "I know, it's just so frustrating. I get a tummy ache every morning at the thought of going to school and facing the teacher and the students and what they might say. And the worst part is, even at home sometimes, my mom says I just need to try harder. And sometimes she even says, 'Jimmy, you need to stop being so lazy.' If she only knew how hard I was trying, Mrs. M. This is so hard." "You're right, Jimmy. This is so difficult. And I'm so sorry that you have to deal with Mrs. Mean and the students on top of everything. But be patient. You're already learning to read. Just keep coming here after school and allowing me and Lucas and Toby to help you. I'm proud of you." "Yeah, you got to keep coming over after school," Lucas said happily. "Come over and join us for a snack," Toby added. As Jimmy, Toby, and Lucas sat and enjoyed their snack together, the doorbell rang. Why, it was Reginald, the postman. "Hello, Mrs. M. How are you today?" "I'm fine, Reginald, thank you. I have a package here all the way from Frogville." "From Frogville? My, that's a mighty distance." "A great distance indeed. Here you go. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, boys. Bye, Mr. Reginald." Mrs. M set the box on the table next to Lucas, Toby, and Jimmy. She opened it carefully. Inside there was a note. "Dear Mrs. M, my son, Red, heard that Lucas, Toby, and Jimmy were missing a very crucial part to their spaceship, the electrical power subsystem. My son, Red, discovered that our air handler worked perfectly. So we sent an extra part so that Lucas, Toby, and Jimmy would now be able to blast off safely, navigating their way in comfortable temperatures. Enjoy this gift from us to you and enjoy your adventures. Sincerely, the family of Red. Red and their family sent us the part we've been missing? Lucas said excitedly. Now we don't have to worry about becoming mousesicles or mouse kebabs, Jimmy said happily. You ain't kidding, I was not looking forward to that possibility, added Toby. Now we'll know where we're going, the navigation system will work. This is incredible, Lucas said. All three jumped up at the same time and asked Mrs. M if they could go work on the shop and install this last piece that they've been waiting for. Absolutely, boys, but make sure that you're home before dark. Yes, Mrs. M. Lucas, Toby, and Jimmy jumped up and ran as fast as they possibly could with their heavy part in hand. They were so excited to finally have their missing piece, so now their adventure can happen. Toby forgot that he still had to work on some of the navigation points, but he was still struggling. He had a hard time with math, but he knew that Jimmy and Lucas would help him out. So when they arrived, he told them the problem that he was having, and they happily joined in. Sometime later, they were able to get up and install the electrical power subsystem. Wow, our rocket is finally complete, Lucas said with a huge grin. I can't believe it. We can finally travel to the moon, Toby added. And beyond, added Jimmy. They all laughed at that. Suddenly, they realized how late it had become because the lights were growing dim. Oh no! Mrs. M said I had to be back home before dark, and you too, said Jimmy. You're right. They all said their goodbyes and headed back home quickly, so as not to be in trouble. It really seems unfair, you know, Toby said. Mrs. M said, What seems unfair, Toby? Well, it seems unfair that Jimmy is being made fun of in class because he can't read yet. But here he is solving our coordinate problems and helping us with the blast-off and our location for our trip. It just seems so unfair. How come someone's considered so unsmart when they can't read well or at all yet, but yet they can make such amazing inventions? It just doesn't make any sense. I agree, Lucas said wholeheartedly. Unfortunately, that's just the way of things, Mrs. M said with a sigh. One day, people will realize that everyone thinks differently, and that's okay. It's the different thinkers and the out-of-box thinkers that help us to have the inventions and the explorations and adventures that we have today. So don't give up hope, Lucas and Toby. Jimmy's going to be okay. We're going to help him. And maybe one day Mrs. Mean won't be quite so mean. I hope so, Lucas and Toby said at the same time in agreement with Mrs. M. Good night, boys. Until tomorrow.